She was 44 years old, and she had buried her husband on a Tuesday and been served an eviction notice by his business partner on the Friday of that same terrible week. It was Reverend Al Discamp, chairman of the Milltown Board of Trustees and the man to whom her late husband owed a debt she had never known existed, who informed her the Millhays cottage was needed for a new foreman, and that she had until the month's end to leave. With $8 saved from her own quilting work and a small trunk of keepsakes, she walked to the far edge of Cross Hollow, Tennessee, where a crumbling stone chapel had stood empty and roofless since a schism split the congregation a decade before, a building the whole town agreed was fit only for the crows. She paid the church-barred $7, the last of what she had, for a ruin nobody else wanted for anything. They called it a foolish, desperate purchase, and worse, the purchase of a woman with nowhere else to turn. But sealed within the walls of the abandoned chapel was something that had waited 10 years to be found, a discovery that would not only save one grieving widow but would stun an entire town into finally reckoning with the truth it had buried along with its own broken faith. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Naomi Whitfield. If you have ever had to rebuild your faith in something after it was broken, tell us in the comments below. Naomi Whitfield had been born Naomi Pruitt in 1843 in the hills above Cross Hollow, Tennessee, the third daughter of a stonemason named Eli Pruitt, a quiet, exacting man whose hands had laid the foundation of half the buildings in the valley, and a mother, Ruth, who kept the family's small farm running through droughts and hard winters. With a discipline Naomi absorbed as thoroughly as she absorbed her father's feel for good stone. Eli Pruitt had that particular philosophy about his trade that he repeated to his daughters as though it were scripture in its own right. A wall built in haste, he would say, running his callous thumb along a seam of mortar, always tells you where it was rushed, and a building's weaknesses are never hidden so much as they are simply waiting for someone patient enough to look. He taught Naomi, more than her sisters, to read a structure the way other men read a ledger, to understand that stone remembered everything done to it, every shortcut, every careful correction, and that a mason who understood this could walk into any building, however old or damaged, and tell its whole history with his hands alone. It was Eli Pruitt, too, who had laid the foundation stones of the very chapel that would one day change his daughter's life. The original Cross Hollow Meeting House, built in 1851 when Naomi was 8 years old, and she remembered still, with a particular clarity of a cherished childhood memory, sitting on an overturned bucket watching her father set the cornerstone, listening to him explain to the assembled congregation that a chapel's foundation needed to last every argument its people would ever have inside it, because arguments came and went, but the building, if built honestly, would still be standing to shelter their grandchildren's reconciliations. The valley's people had laughed warmly at the observation, not knowing, as Naomi would only understand decades later, how precisely her father had predicted the fracture that would eventually split the very congregation he was building a home for. Naomi's mother taught her a different but complementary set of skills, keeping the family accounts with meticulous care, stretching a small harvest across a long winter, and above all teaching her daughters that a woman's worth in a hard country was measured by what she could build and mend rather than by what she was given. By 17, Naomi could keep books, tend a kitchen garden through any drought, sew a quilt fine enough to sell at a counterfeit, and read a stone wall as fluently as her father, and it was this last, unusual skill that first caught the attention of a young mill supervisor named Thaddeus Whitfield, who had come to Cross Hollow to help establish the valley's first proper cotton mill, and who, upon hearing Eli Pruitt's daughter correct a visiting engineer about a foundation crack the man had misdiagnosed, found himself thoroughly and permanently smitten. They married in the spring of 1862 in the very chapel her father had built, and for a time their life together was steady and industrious, Thaddeus rising through the mill's management as the operation grew, Naomi keeping their household accounts with the same careful hand her mother had taught her, and both of them active in the life of the Cross Hollow congregation that had watched Naomi grow from a girl on an overturned bucket into a respected wife and neighbor. It was during these years that Naomi first became aware, in the peripheral way one becomes aware of adult conflicts as a young wife rather than a principal party to them, of a slow-building tension within the congregation itself, a disagreement between the church's founding families and a newer faction, led increasingly by an ambitious deacon named Al Discamp, over matters that seemed at the time to concern doctrine and governance, but that Naomi's mother, in no name of her rare moments of unguarded cynicism, suggested had rather more to do with who would control the substantial charitable trust the congregation had built up over its first decade, funds donated by the valley's original mill investors for the relief of workers injured or widowed in mill's operations. The schism, When it finally came in 1877, split Cross Hollow's congregation in two, with Alderscamp's faction, which included most of the mill's ownership and management, retreating to build a newer, grander church in town proper, while the older, poorer families who had built their original chapel found themselves gradually unable to maintain it, their numbers dwindling as the congregation's wealth and influence consolidated elsewhere. The original chapel, Naomi's father's chapel, fell into disuse within a few years, its roof eventually failing under a heavy snow load, its windows broken by neglect and idle boys, until it stood, by the time of this story, as little more than a stone shell at the edge of town, remembered mainly for the argument that had emptied it rather than for the community it had once sheltered. Naomi had watched this slow decay with a private grief she rarely spoke of even to Thaddeus, understanding it as something larger than the loss of a building, the loss of whatever fragile common purpose had once held Cross Hollow's people together. Thaddeus Whitfield's death came suddenly in the autumn of 1887, a fever contracted during an outbreak that swept through the mill workers' quarters, and Naomi, 44 years old and childless after a marriage of 25 years, found herself widowed, and, within days, confronted with a discovery nearly as devastating as her grief, that Thaddeus, in his later years of increasing responsibility at the mill, had personally guaranteed a substantial loan taken out by mill's ownership during a difficult financial stretch, a loan that Reverend Alderscamp, now both church chairman and a principal mill investor, held the paper on. With Thaddeus gone, Kemp moved with a speed that left Naomi little room to process her grief before it was compounded by practical catastrophe, informing her within the week that the Millhays cottage, company property that Thaddeus's position had entitled them to occupy, was needed for the family of a new foreman, and that whatever remained of Thaddeus's modest savings would be applied against the outstanding loan rather than left to his widow. Naomi did not fight the accounting understanding with her mother's clear-eyed practicality that she had neither the money for lawyers nor any real standing to contest a debt her husband had genuinely incurred, however unjustly its collection now felt in the immediate aftermath of his death. What she had, when the Millhays was finally emptied and the last of the settlement paperwork signed, was $8 saved from years of quilting commissions taken quietly on side, a trunk containing her mother's linens and a few of her father's smaller stone working tools, and a grief so large and so recently doubled that she found herself, for the first time in her adult life, entirely without a clear next step. She was 44 years old, with no children to lean on, no property, and a town whose most powerful figure had just profited considerably from her husband's debt. It was in this state, walking the perimeter of Cross Hollow with no particular destination, that Naomi found herself once again standing before her father's crumbling chapel, a building she had avoided visiting closely for years out of a grief she had not fully named even to herself, seeing it now roofless and hollow-eyed with its broken windows. She found herself doing something she had not expected, reading it, the way her father had taught her, running her eyes along the old foundation lines, noting with a mason's daughter's eye that the stonework itself, despite a decade of neglect, showed almost none of the settling or cracking that plagued the newer, hastily built church in town. Her father's walls, she thought, still remembered how carefully they had been built. She learned that the church board, now entirely controlled by Kemp's faction and eager to be free of the tax liability the abandoned chapel represented, had quietly authorized that Sale Tohover would take the property off their hands, and she found herself, almost before she had consciously decided anything, standing before the board with her $8, offering $7 off them for the chapel and its small surrounding lot. The board members, Kemp included, regarded the offer with barely concealed amusement, one remarking that the widow Whitfield seemed intent on collecting ruins to match her ruined circumstances, but they accepted without hesitation, glad to be rid of an obligation, and helped her draw up a simple deed. Word moved through Cross Hollow with predictable speed. Women who had once sat beside Naomi in the newer church's pews wondered aloud whether grief had unsettled her reason, and men outside the mercantile remarked that Whitfield's widow had traded her last dollar for a roofless tomb. Naomi heard all of it and said little, understanding, as she always had, that the town's opinion of her decision was rarely worth as much as it believed itself to be. What she found when she began clearing the chapel in the first days of her ownership was a building that confirmed everything her mason's eye had suggested. The foundation and lower walls, her father's original work, remained entirely sound beneath their coating of grime and ivy, and even the fire-scarred sections near where the old wood-shingled roof had eventually collapsed showed stone construction solid enough to rebuild upon. She worked with what tools she had, clearing debris, salvaging what timber remained usable, and it was on her sixth-day ophibor, while she was examining the chapel's rear wall near where her father had once built asmal robing alcove for the minister, that her practice I caught something the untrained eye would have missed entirely, a seam in the stonework, barely visible beneath decades of grime, that did not match the coursing pattern of the surrounding wall. A seam that told her, as clearly as if her father had written it in a letter, that this section of wall had been built or rebuilt separately from the rest, and more recently she worked at the seam carefully with a chisel from her father's old tool roll, and after nearly an hour of patient effort, a section of the wall, roughly 2 feet square, came loose as a single unit, revealing behind it a shallow cavity that her father had evidently built into the original construction, a hidden space no larger than a small cupboard, lined with slate to keep out damp inside. Wrapped in oilcloth long since gone stiff and dark, she found a bundle of papers and beneath them a small iron strongbox. Her hands trembled as she lifted them free, understanding even before she opened anything that her father, a man of few words but evident hidden depths, had built a secret into the very walls of the chapel he raised, a secret he had never spoken to anyone, including, so far as Naomi knew, her own mother. She carried her find to the one dry corner of the chapel where she had set up a small camp, and by the light of a borrowed lamp, she opened the papers first. They were, she realized with growing astonishment, not her father's writing at all, but a careful accounting kept by the chapel's earliest minister, a man named Reverend Josiah Barrow, who had served the original congregation from its founding in 1851 until his death in 1863, during the darkest years of the war. What the papers revealed, as Naomi read deep into that first night, was a story Cross Hollow had entirely forgotten, or perhaps had never fully known. Reverend Barrow, it emerged, had used the chapel during the war years as a station on an informal but carefully organized relief network, providing refuge and assistance to escaped and freed people making their way north, as well as the Union's sympathizers and deserters from both armies hiding from conscription officers who patrolled the valley with increasing brutality as the war dragged on. The strongbox contained gold coin, a sum Naomi calculated at nearly $90, along with a list, written in Reverend Barrow's careful hand, of the mill's original charitable trust, the very fund whose control had triggered the congregation's schism years later. The papers made clear what Naomi had never known and what, she suspected, almost no one now living in Cross Hollow remembered, that the original charitable trust had been established not by the mill's investors in a spirit of simple benevolence, as the official history held, but specifically at Reverend Barrow's insistence, funded in part by a wealthy northern sympathizer who had passed through the valley during the war and left a substantial gift with a minister on condition that it be used, in perpetuity, for the relief of the valley's poorest families regardless of their role or loyalty during the conflict, a condition Barrow had recorded meticulously precisely because he feared, even then, that the mill's ownership would eventually try to redirect the funds toward their own interests once the war's passions cooled and memories faded. He had hidden this founding document, along with the gold representing an unspent portion of their original gift, in the wall Eli Pruitt had built for him, trusting the mason's discretion, and had died of a sudden illness in 1863 before he could ensure the arrangement was properly understood by whoever succeeded him. Naomi sat with this discovery for a long while, understanding with mounting clarity precisely what she was holding, proof that the charitable trust whose control had split her father's congregation, and whose ultimate consolidation under Aldous Kemp's authority had directly enabled Kemp's aggressive collection against her husband's estate, had never been legitimately his or the mill ownership's control in the first place. It had been established as an independent, binding trust for the valley's poor, a purpose from which it had been quietly and gradually diverted over 20 years until it functioned, in practice, as a discretionary fund Kemp used largely to reward mill loyalty and punish those who crossed him. She thought of the families across Cross Hollow who had been denied assistance from that very trust over the years, and she thought, with a clarity that steadied rather than frightened her, that the stone wall her father had built had waited a quarter-century to correct an injustice he could not have known when he laid it. Whatever need correcting, she did not act with haste. She spent the following days finishing the chapel's most urgent repairs, patching a section of roof with salvaged timber to protect what she had found, and turning the discovery over with her father's own unhurried patience. She resolved to first confirm what she could of Reverend Barrow's account through the town's older residents before bringing it forward, reasoning correctly that a claim resting solely on one widow's discovery would be dismissed by Kemp's faction as fabrication or misunderstanding. It was an elderly former deacon named Obadiah Wren, one of the few surviving members of the original congregation still living in Cross Hollow, frail now and largely ignored by the town's current leadership, who confirmed to Naomi, once she showed him the papers, that he remembered as a boy hearing whispers about a northern benefactor's gift and about Reverend Barrow's fierce insistence, in his final sermons, that the trust must never fall under any single family's control, memories Wren had assumed. Lost entirely with the old minister's death and the schism that followed, word of Naomi's find inevitably began moving through Cross Hollow before she felt fully prepared. For Obadiah Wren, delighted to finally have his old memories validated, mentioned the discovery to a neighbor, and within days the story, considerably distorted, reached Aldous Kemp himself. He came to the chapel on a cool afternoon, dressed in his fine dark coat, and found Naomi repairing a section of the old altar rail, and he did not trouble himself with condolence she had never genuinely offered. He told her plainly that whatever old papers she believed she had found held no standing against 20 years of the trust's established administration under proper church governance, and that a widow already indebted to the mill would be wise token side of the consequences of stirring up disputes best left buried with the men who started them. Naomi, who had spent the worst week of her life watching Kemp collect against her husband's estate with barely a pretense of sympathy, told him only that she intended to see Reverend Barrow's true intentions on it, and that he was welcome to contest the matter before whoever in the valley still remembered what honest dealing looked like. It was not an empty response, and Kemp seemed to sense it. For within days the church board, now entirely his instrument, sent formal notice questioning the validity of Naomi's deed to the chapel property, citing an irregularity in the original sale paperwork that Naomi suspected correctly had been invented for the occasion. She understood precisely what pressure was being applied and by whom, and she understood too that she had no money for lawyers and little standing in a town where Kemp's word carried the weight of 2 decades of consolidated influence. What she had was Reverend Barrow's ledger, Obadiah Wren corroborating memory, and a growing certainty that the only way to protect the truth now was to make it impossible for one man's authority to quietly bury it a second time. She brought her discovery not to the church board, whose composure she no longer trusted, but to the circuit judge who rode through the valley twice yearly to hear disputes too large for local resolution, a stern, unhurried man named Judge Corwin Marsh, who examined Barrow's original trust documentation, cross-referenced its language against the mill's own founding charter records held at the county courthouse, and confirmed, to Naomi's profound relief, that the trust's original conditions, as Barrow had recorded them, were indeed still legally binding regardless of how loosely they had been administered in the decades since. Judge Marsh's ruling, delivered the following month before a courtroom that included a considerable portion of Cross Hollow's population, restored the charitable trust to independent administration under a board that explicitly excluded any mill officer or investor, and further found that Kemp's collection against Thaddeus Whitfield's estate, structured as it had been through his dual role as both creditor and trust administrator, had involved a conflict of interest serious enough to warrant a partial reversal, restoring to Naomi a meaningful portion of what had been taken. Naomi did not seek Kemp's complete ruin, and she said as much plainly when he came to the rebuilt chapel one final time, considerably diminished in the town's estimation, to ask what she intended to do with her restored standing. She told him only that she intended to see the trust properly administered for the purpose Barrow had always meant it to serve, the relief of the valley's poorest families regardless of old grievances, and that whatever remained of his position on the church board was a matter between him and a congregation that had finally learned the true history of what it had been arguing over for 20 years. The gold coin from the Strongbacks, together with donations that began arriving once the story became known throughout the valley, went toward completing the chapel's restoration, and within a year the original Cross Hollow meeting house stood rebuilt, its roof sound, its doors open once more, serving now as the seat of the restored trust and a gathering place for exactly the kind of relief work Reverend Barrow had envisioned a quarter century before.